First person I want to introduce you all to, Dr. Alondra Nelson is incredible. Her work as a professor at Columbia and as an author covers that intersection of what our genetic and biological selves that can be captured in big data mean and how that intersects with our identities as political and social people as we face in the mirror every day. And that is an incredible and rich vein of work and a really important starting point for this conversation. So I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Alondra Nelson.
Good evening. Thank you, Anil. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Nicole, and both your teams for inviting me to be here tonight. So Anil wanted us to sort of think about a question, or the question that brought us to this conversation. And the question for me really drew on a decade of work of small data on thinking about the social circulation of genetic ancestry testing and direct-to-consumer genetics. And so I found in the course of doing this ethnographic work and this field work that although social scientists and research scientists were likely to think about genetic ancestry testing as being definitely distinct from medical testing, genetic testing, and definitely distinct from criminal justice forensic DNA testing, that on the ground in the way that people thought about these testing, these forms of analysis actually were kind of overlapping and related in the minds of people. And I came to see, and talking to people, that they were also overlapping in the way that they kind of socially function and circulate. And so my small data problem became a big data problem, and this is really where I began. So to begin, before talking about this 21st century big data problem, I want to take us back to a 19th century thinker, in particular Walt Whitman, and his Song of Myself, who writes, "I am large, I contain multitudes." So this quote, of course, is taken from Whitman's signature work, Leaves of Grass, and I think for me it encapsulates the issues that I want to raise in tonight's conversation. So I am large, and thinking about genetic testing and genetic analysis in particular. Large in the sense that the human genome contains an estimated 3 million base pairs, the big data of human life. And large also in the sense that genes that are rendered as data contain potentially boundless information about individuals as well as their biological communities, limited only by the questions we might hope to ask and the algorithms or other tools we might use to analyze or answer them. So the I, and the I am large, is the royal I. I contain multitudes. Multitudes in the sense that genetic data contains information that can be used in varied aspects of society. Genetic data is multivocal. The same data may be used in genealogical, medical, or forensic domains, for example. So in other words, I want us to not forget that genes are omnibus, that they contain many types of information simultaneously. And so in thinking about big data, I think that the individual collective uniqueness and identifiability of data and its ability to use it for many purposes may make genetic information distinct among the other types of big data information that we'll talk about tonight, but this might be a debatable point. So I contain multitudes also in the sense that genes are transitional. Not only does genetic data not necessarily abide the classifications or constraints that we place around it, this data is also increasingly moving between institutions and organizations. This means that we need ethical guidelines and policies that are specific to the genetic data in the criminal justice system and the direct-to-consumer marketplace or in the medical setting, and at the same time, that can also take account of the fact that genetic data moves across and between these boundaries. So I want to present two examples that force us to think about big data outside of these institutional silos, examples that bring into relief, in particular, the particular vulnerability of some communities, marginalized communities. So the first one. Most of you are aware of the story of Henrietta Lacks and of the cancer cells that were taken from her without her or her family's knowledge or permission and live on today as the HeLa cell line, thanks in large part to Rebecca Skloot's extraordinary book. A few of you may know that last March, a team of European scientists sequenced the genome of the HeLa cell, and for a time made the sequence available online. And they emphasize in this paper that they were really after sort of trying to get at some of the problems that Rebecca described in the book about using the HeLa cell line, right? And to use genetic analysis to be able to understand how these cell lines might act in the laboratory. But they also stressed in this paper, these scientists, that, quote, you couldn't infer anything about Henrietta Lacks' genome or her descendants from the data generated from this study, close quote. However, we would soon discover that both health and ancestry information, not only about Henrietta Lacks, but also about her descendants, was available via the HeLa genome. Proving the point, a researcher uploaded the HeLa genome to SNPpedia, a wiki site that translates genetic information about Henrietta, and easily came up with a good deal of personal information about Lacks and her family. And the SNPpedia, those of you who are familiar with it, can reveal information about genetic markers for physical appearance, for disease predisposition, or for behavioral traits, right? So it contains a lot of information just based on the genome. So what was shocking about this, given what we know about how the HeLa cell line came to be, was a lack of concern about privacy and about consent, and the kind of abstraction of the data of the genome that resulted, I think, in a kind of dehumanization of data. I think that we should be concerned about, and that should be foremost in our conversations about the implications, the ethical implications of big data. So there was a resolution to this that was happier than the resolution that occurred for Henrietta Lacks in 1951 when her cells were taken at Johns Hopkins Hospital. In August 2013, in an historic agreement, her family reached an agreement with the NIH that allowed for restricted approved access of this data and application and use of this data by researchers only for biomedical purposes. But the research nevertheless will continue to reveal multitudes about the Lacks family. So the second example I want to raise is the issue of familial searching. Genetic genealogists have long used DNA technology for at least a decade to identify roots. And for longer still, law enforcement officials have used genetic technology to identify suspects. More recently, these two forms of genetic analysis have come together. These two practices have merged in the form of familial searching. The criminal justice system and police authorities increasingly use partial DNA matches to track criminal suspects with matches to members of their family who are already in a criminal DNA database. And familial searching has been in the news a lot in the last few years because it's helped to solve several high-profile cases. Of course, the Grim Reaper case, serial killer case in Los Angeles, in which the DNA of a suspect's son led to the apprehension and conviction of a perpetrator. And a few years before this, the apprehension of the BTK serial murder, which was accomplished in part through the analysis of the DNA of the suspect's daughter, obtained through a sample from his daughter's pap smear sample at a public hospital. These uses of genetic data for familial searching, I want to remind us, occur against the backdrop of the growth of state and local forensic databases of people convicted of crimes and of those increasingly just merely arrested. This practice was solidified by the Marilyn B. King Supreme Court decision last year that made it legal for police to take DNA samples when one is booked for a crime merely. A decision that conservative Justice Antonin Scalia described this way, quote, "Because of today's decision, your DNA can be taken and entered into a national database if you are ever arrested, rightly or wrongly, and for whatever reason," close quote. Given the racially discriminatory nature of the criminal justice system, in the post-Marilyn v. King terrain, familial searching poses significant risks for minority communities. For example, we know that African Americans comprise about 13% of the US population, but more than 40% of people convicted of felonies annually, and a far greater percentage of persons arrested. Closer to home, recall that here in New York in 2011, under the stop and frisk regime, more black men were stopped in New York City than actually live in the city itself. As well, in the same year, 93% of black men living in the Brownsville, Brooklyn neighborhood were stopped by police. Thus, it is not a stretch to suggest that there are communities and families that are and will be subject to disproportionate genetic surveillance simply because one member of the family committed a crime, or importantly, was simply booked for a crime, whether or not he or she is convicted. So again, in this case, there's a case here of overlapping genealogical genetic and forensic genetics overlapping. And what I want to suggest is that we need a flexible, analytical, ethical, and regulatory approach to account for the inherent characteristics of DNA that make it informative simultaneously in these different numerous contexts. So what's to be done? I think we need to continue to use specific institutional regulations, right? So I think that it's important that we have bioethical codes or the FDA oversight in medical institutions. But we need policies beyond these as well. And there are two examples of regulatory lag with regards to genetic analysis, I think, that bear mentioning. So, for example, although the implementation of the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008, the GINA Act, which prevents employers and health insurers from discriminating on the basis of DNA analysis, is partly helpful in the regard of sort of fomenting or holding back the discrimination that I'm talking about. And in fact, there was so much hope for this act that the late Democratic Senator Edward Kennedy called the GINA Act, quote, the first civil rights bill of the new century of life sciences, close quote. But the GINA Act only applies to medical genetic testing. So there's no protection from discrimination from other forms of DNA analysis, be it in the criminal justice system or in a genetic genealogy system that can yield data or information about healthcare. Similarly, because most genetic ancestry tracing companies are privately owned and funded, and technically speaking non-medical, they are not considered covered entities and do not fall under the purview of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, or HIPAA, which guarantees that patients' genetic results will be kept private and protects him or her from potential discrimination. So these are two places in which the silos, the institutional silos, the regulatory silos, I think do a disservice to the ways that individuals I've spoken to think about DNA testing and the way that it circulates in real life, and increasingly the way these things are overlapping. So I want to suggest that we need policies that take what I call the social life of DNA into account. We need to build a system of ethics and regulations that work both specific to the genetics of criminal forensics or medical genetics or genetic genealogy, but also to how the social and ethical opportunities and challenges posed by genetic data circulate both between and beyond these as well. Thank you.